earliest manuscript known is an Arabic manuscript from Syria, Aleppo, Syria. And so in honor of that, I think we should all speak a little Arabic tonight. You're up for that. So, Mastacher, Mastacher. Your reply is Masanur. So I said, evening of goodness, Masacher, and you say, evening of light. Light. If you want to get a little more traditional, we can say, Assalamu alaikum, and you will reply, wa alaikum assalam. Wa alaikum assalam. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Stories are very important to us, and I think that's why this collection is so special. And they function in our lives. We can't really live without them. They teach us to make passages in our life. They equip us to cross thresholds into the various stages of life that we enter. They bind us with our communities, and they take us deep within ourselves to learn, to gain self-knowledge, and besides that, they're just darn fun and entertaining. And the Arabian Nights is all of those things. We will call it the 1001 Nights, although it's known also as Arabian Nights entertainments, various terms, so all of those will apply, but pick whichever one you want to. I'm really so happy to have students involved in this event. It is a reading. Let me get the names back up there. So I'll quickly introduce our cast. These are all English majors and minor. We have some graduate students here. We have representatives of Sigma Tau Delta, our English Honor Society, and we have some students from my poetry writing class. Poetry writing class, not poetry writing. That's what Terry Dowling called. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about how we work here. We're all reading multiple parts. And if you'll notice here, I'm calling it selected readings, selected stories, together with observations and insights of sundry admirers. So what we've done is selected a few stories, actually two, and then the framing story of the nights. And then we've interspersed this with criticism. The sundry admirers include critics and observers, other writers, and artists who have been inspired by the Arabian Nights. So first, all of these students are taking multiple roles, except for Shahrazad. She is the key figure in the Nights and kind of the principal voice of the Arabian Nights and narrator, as you'll learn. So first we have Nathan Cumberland, and from the Nights itself, he'll read the Merchant, a very important character in the first act, and the Sinbad Porter later on, and then his critical voices are Jerome Clinton and Joseph Campbell. Then we have Chris Gaither, who is our demon. That is the Hussein translation. It's evil jinn or iftar. There's various ways of calling this, but the jinn are shapeshifters, and they can be good Muslims or they can be not good people, not Muslims. So I once had someone in a group of students come to my flat in Aleppo, and they watched very carefully as I prepared the tea, making sure I was not a genie and didn't put something in the tea. So believe that they're real. Chris will play the role of the demon and King Shahryar, the person who needs some help, and also will do the principal part of Sinbad, the sailor, in our second story. Courtney Goff, here, will be Dinarzad, the sister of Shahrazad, and she'll play the merchant's wife. She also will read some from Sinbad. We've broken this up to spread the work out. And she also plays a servant in the Sinbad story. She'll read the voice of Robert Irwin, who wrote the companion to the Arabian Nights. It's a really important part of the research. And Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentinian novelist, has a few lines in here, and Suzanne Inderwitz. Then Amanda Hill here is our Shahrazad. And Javier Medina plays the compiler. We've got a couple of layers of narration, so we're calling him the compiler, the one who's commenting on the story, sort of the writer, if you will. And he also plays the king and has a part of Sinbad's role and the critical voice of Hugo von Hofmannsthal, great German poet. And then Ariel Reynolds here is an old man in the first story, and she'll read some pieces of the Sinbad story as well. The Sinbad narrates his fourth voyage, and a neighbor in that too, and then critical voices of Lisa Perfetti, Abdel Fattah Khalito, and Mia Irene Gerhardt. So without further ado, we will begin the show.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, in him I trust. Praise be to God, the beneficent King, the creator of the world and man, who raised the heavens without pillars, and spread out the earth as a place of rest, and erected mountains as props, and made the water flow from the hard rock, and destroyed the race of Thamud, Ad, and Pharaoh the vast domain. I praise him, the supreme Lord, for his guidance, and I thank him for his infinite grace. To proceed, I shall have to inform the honorable gentlemen and noble readers that the purpose of writing this agreeable and entertaining book is the instruction of those who peruse it. For it abounds with highly edifying histories and excellent lessons for people of distinction, and it provides them with the opportunity to learn the art of discourse, as well as what happened to the kings in the beginnings of time. This book, which I have called The 1001 Nights, abounds also with splendid biographies that teach the reader to detect deception and to protect himself from it, as well as delight and divert him whenever he is burdened with the cares of life and the ills of this world. It is the supreme God who is a true guide.
It has been related to me, O happy king, that there was a certain merchant who had great wealth and traded extensively with surrounding countries, and one day he mounted his horse and journeyed to a neighboring country to collect what was due to him, and, the heat oppressing him, he sat under a tree in a garden and put his hand into his saddlebag and ate a morsel of bread and a date which were among his provisions. Having eaten the date, he threw aside the stone, and immediately there before him appeared an Efret, an evil jinn of enormous height, who, holding a drawn sword in his hand, approached him and said,
"Get up so that I may kill you with the sword, just as you have killed my son."
The merchant asked him,
"How have I killed your son?"
"When you ate the date and threw aside the stone, it struck my son upon the chest, and as fate has decreed against him, he instantly died."
Verily to God we belong, and verily to him we must return. There is no strength nor power but in God, the high, the great. If I killed him, I did it without knowing it, and I trust that you will pardon me.
"By God, I must kill you as you have killed my son."
and so saying, he dragged him and threw him on the ground, and raised his arm to strike him with the sword. The merchant, upon this, wept bitterly, and said to the jinn,
I commit my affair unto God, for no one can avoid what he has decreed. Life has 2 days, one peace, one weariness, and has 2 sides, worry and happiness. Ask him who taunts us with adversity. Does fate accept those worthy of note oppress? You thought well of the days when they were good, oblivious to the ills destined for one. You were deluded by the peaceful nights, yet in the peace of night the sorrow stood.
When the merchant finished and stopped weeping, the demon said,
"By God, I must kill you as you killed my son, even if you weep blood."
Must you?
I must.
And he raised his sword to strike.
But morning overtook Shahrazad, and she lapsed into silence, leaving King Shahryar burning with curiosity to hear the rest of the story. Then Dinazad said to her sister Shahrazad,
What a strange and wonderful story.
and Shahrazad replied,
What is this compared with what I'll tell you tomorrow night, if the king spares me and lets me live? It will be even better and more entertaining.
The king thought to himself,
I will spare her until I hear the rest of the story. Then I will have her put to death the next day.
The title of the story collection in Arabic is Alf Layla Wa Layla, literally 1,000 nights and a night. But the 18th century English translation of Antoine Galland's French version was called The Arabian Nights Entertainments. The one thing that all the collections have in common is that the stories ended are supposed to have been told by Shahrazad to King Shahryar. Shahryar, a mythical king in ancient times, on discovering his wife's infidelity with the kitchen servant, had the wife put to death, and from that time on, fearing further sexual betrayals, he took virgins to his bed for one night only, invariably having them beheaded on the following morning. After the slaughtering had gone on for some time, the vizier's daughter, who was called Shahrazad, volunteered herself as the next candidate for the king's bed. Brought before the king, she asked that her sister Dinarzad might attend her. She had already put Dinarzad up to asking for a story. Dinarzad, inconspicuously installed in Shahryar's bedchamber, waited until he had finished with her sister. Then, when she judged the moment was right, she asked her sister for a story. Shahrazad obliged her with the story of the merchant and the demon, but since she did not relate all of it that night, Shahryar was impelled to postpone her execution so that he might hear the end of it on the following night. The following night the story continued, but it did not conclude. Instead, Shahrazad began another story inset within the first one, and broke off with this story also in the Princess Dawn was breaking. And so things continued for 2 years and 271 days, if we are to take the 1001 of the title literally, with Shahrazad, night by night, talking for her life. Robert Irwin, author of The Arabian Nights, a companion.
It has become a commonplace among readers of the nights that Shahrazad's endless spinning of tales is a survival strategy through which she manages to save her life by proving to King Shahryar that her wonderful stories are worthy of his keeping her alive. It is less often acknowledged that Shahrazad is telling stories to save the lives of all unmarried women, not just her own. The communal rather than individual nature of her project is made explicit in her statement to her father, the king's vizier.
I would like you to marry me to King Shahryar so that I may either succeed in saving the people or perish and die like the rest.
This mission is recalled continuously throughout the nights, so that far more than a simple device for linking the stories together, Shahrazad serves as the nexus of 3 intertwining threads concerning the representation of women in the medieval Arab world: eloquence, sexuality, and cunning. Lisa Perfetti, author of Women and Laughter in Medieval Comic Literature.
When morning broke, the day dawned, and the sun rose. The king left to attend to affairs of the kingdom, and the vizier, Shahrazad's father, was amazed and delighted, for it was the first day the king had spared his virgin bride. King Shahryar governed all day and returned at night to his quarters, and got into bed with Shahrazad. Then Dinazad said to his sister Shahrazad,
Please, sister, if you are not sleepy, tell us one of your lovely little tales to while away the night.
the king added,
Let it be the conclusion of the story of the demon and the merchant, for I would like to hear it.
With the greatest pleasure, dear and happy king.
One feels like getting lost in 1001 Nights. One knows that entering that book, one can forget one's own poor human fate. One can enter a world made up of archetypal figures, but also of individuals. Jorge Luis Borges, Argentine short story writer, essayist, poet, and translator.
Who is a good reader of the nights? Definitely not the one who would see there only the extraordinary stories, the ones that distract and astonish. The good reader is the one who satisfies two conditions. In the first place, he must practice ibra, that is, reflect when he learns what has happened to others, on what could have happened to him. The stories are thus paradigms that orient choices and clarify action. In the second place, the reader is implicitly invited to write the stories or to recopy them if possible, in golden letters, as do so many of the characters of the Knights. Thus said, they will be constantly available, bringing him pleasure and knowledge. On what material should one write them? Entrusted to a book, they run the risk of becoming external, foreign. The ideal would then be to write them on one's own body, and even, horrible prospect, on the corner of one's eye. Adelpha Takalito, the eye of the needle.
It is related, O wise and happy king, that when the demon raised his sword, the merchant asked the demon again.
Must you kill me?
And the demon replied.
Yes.
Then the merchant said,
Please give me time to say goodbye to my family and my wife and children. Divide my property among them and appoint guardians. Then I shall come back so that you may kill me.
I'm afraid that if I release you and grant you time, you will go and do what you wish, but will not come back.
I swear to keep my pledge to come back as the God of heaven and earth is my witness.
How much time do you need?
1 year, so that I may see enough of my children, bid my wife goodbye, discharge my obligations to people, and come back on New Year's Day.
Do you swear to God that if I let you go, you will come back?
Yes, I swear to God.
the demon released him, and he mounted his horse sadly and went on his way.
The jinn, singular jinn or genie, were thought of as supernatural creatures with bodies of flame. They were normally invisible, and so it was that the merchant inadvertently killed the son of a jinn by throwing away a date stone. However, they frequently make themselves visible in the night. Though they normally appear as human beings, this was not always the case. The jinn were shapeshifters. Very commonly, jinn were traveled about as whirlwinds. There are good Muslim jinn, and there are evil infidel jinn. Whereas in the medieval West, it was possible for some skeptical spirits to dismiss any story concerning fairies as an old wives' tale, the medieval Muslim could not dismiss the possibility of the existence of the jinn so easily, for they are repeatedly attested to in the Quran. For example, in a passage about Solomon's control of the jinn. And of the jinn, some worked before him by leave of his Lord, and such of them as swerved away from our commandment, we would let them taste the chastisement of the blades. This is from the 24th surah of the Noble Quran. Robert Irwin, author of The Arabian Nights, Companion.
The merchant journeyed until he reached his home and came to his wife and children. When he saw them, he wept bitterly. And when his family saw his sorrow and grief, they began to reproach him for his behavior. And his wife said,
Husband, what is the matter with you? Why do you mourn when we are all happy celebrating your return?
Why not mourn when I have only 1 year to live?
Then he told her of his encounter with the demon and informed her that he had sworn to return on New Year's Day so that the demon might kill him. When they heard what he said, everyone began to cry. His wife struck her face in lamentation and cut her hair. His daughters wailed and his little children cried. It was a day of mourning, as all the children gathered around their father to weep and exchange goodbyes. The next day, he wrote his will, divided his property, discharged his obligations to people, left bequests and gifts, distributed alms, and engaged reciters to read portions of the Quran in his house. Then he summoned legal witnesses, and in their presence freed his slaves and slave girls, divided among his elder children their shares of the property, appointed guardians for his little ones, and gave his wife her share according to the marriage contract. He spent the rest of the time with his family, and when the year came to an end, save for the time he needed for the journey, he performed his ablutions, performed his prayers, and carrying his burial shroud, began to bid his family goodbye. His sons hung around his neck, his daughters wept, and his wife wailed. Their mourning scared him, and began to weep as he embraced and kissed his children goodbye. He said to them,
Children, this is God's will and decree, for man was created to die.
Then he turned away, and, mounting his horse, journeyed day and night until he reached the orchard. He sat in the place where he had eaten the dates, waiting for the demon, with a heavy heart and tearful eyes. As he waited, an old man leading a deer on a leash approached him and greeted him, and he returned the greeting. The old man inquired,
Friend, why do you sit here in this place of demons and devils? For in this haunted orchard none come to good.
The merchant replied by telling him what had happened to him and the demon, from the beginning to the end. The old man was amazed at the merchant's fidelity and said,
Yours is a magnificent pledge. By God, I shall not leave until I see what will happen to you with the demon.
Then he sat down beside him and chatted as they talked.
But morning overtook Shahrazad, and she lapsed into silence. As the day dawned and it was light, her sister Dinazad said,
What a strange and wonderful story.
Shahrazad replied,
Tomorrow night I shall tell something even stranger and more wonderful than this, if the king will let me live.
Thus ends the second of 1001 Nights. In fact, it will take Shahrazad 6 more nights to complete the story of the demon and the merchant, as 3 old men arrive with strange companions. The demon is curious to hear each of their stories and agrees to grant each old man a third of his claim upon the merchant's guilt in exchange for a story that satisfies him. This cycle of tales, which opens the nights, is finally completed on the 8th night.
I heard, O happy king, that the third old man told the demon a story that was even stranger and more amazing than the first 2. The demon was very much amazed and, swaying with delight, said,
I grant you the final 1/3 of the claim on this merchant for his crime.
Then the demon released the merchant and departed. The merchant turned to the 3 old men and thanked them, and they congratulated him on his deliverance and bade him goodbye. Then they separated, and each of them went on his way. The merchant himself went back to his family, his wife, and his children, and he lived with them until the day he died. But this story is not as strange or as amazing as the story of the fisherman.
In the modern Middle East, with certain exceptions, the Nights is not regarded by Arab intellectuals as literature at all. It is true that the literary merit of the stories is variable, and to some extent a matter of taste anyway. Some of the tales are naive and vulgar, or even, if they're worse, starkly incomprehensible in the form in which they survived. However, the best of the stories are artfully constructed, highly sophisticated fictions. They are works of literature in the fullest sense. They deserve to be read as the products of a highly literary culture. Antoine Galland, 1646 to 1750, the first European translator of the Nights, played so large a part in discovering the tales, in popularizing them in Europe, and in shaping what would come to be regarded as the canonical collection, that, at some risk of hyperbole and paradox, he has been called the real author of the Nights. Galland asks himself why Europeans are so interested in the Islamic world, while there is so little reciprocal interest on the part of Muslims in Christian Europe's civilization and society. Galland argued that Islamic literature was so rich and of such a high quality that it was self-sufficient. Galland's decorous claim that in translating the Nights was not so much to just transcribe accurately the real texture of medieval Arab prose, as to rescue from it items that he judged would please the salons of 18th century France. Robert Irwin, author of The Arabian Nights and Companion. Nothing is consubstantial with literature and its modest mystery as the questions raised by translation. Jorge Luis Borges.
No ornamentation is intended, no suggestion of something higher, no allegory, no other allegory at least, than one which helped paint the sensual even more sensually, the living even more vividly. The mouth does not open wide in order to summon a higher world. It is merely like breathing through the pores. But we are breathing through the pores of this naively poetic language, the air of an age-old holy world, in which angels and demons float through, and forest and desert animals are venerated like patriarchs and kings. In this way, the vulgarity, the unseemly particularity, even the swear word becomes not infrequently like a window through which we believe to be peeking into a mysteriously illuminated world of intuitions, indeed, even into higher mysteries. As we see boundless sensuality illuminate itself from within with its own light, so this whole is at the same time interwoven with a poetic spirituality, in which we advance from first awareness to complete understanding with the most vivid delight. In intuition, the presence of God, that is indescribable lies in all of these sensual things. The canopy of the radiant sun or the holy starry sky are always overstretched over this confusion of human, animal, and demonic. And like a gentle, pure, and great wind, the eternal, simple, holy sentiments, hospitality, piety, faithfulness, bloom through the whole. Hugo von Hofmannsthal, 19th century poet and novelist.
It is related, O happy king, that in the times of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there lived in Baghdad a poor porter named Sinbad, who on a very hot day was sent to carry a heavy load from one end of the city to the other. Before he had accomplished half the distance, he was so tired that finding himself in a quiet street where the pavement was sprinkled with rose water and a cool breeze was blowing, he set his burden upon the ground and sat down to rest in the shade of a grand house. Very soon, he decided that he could not have chosen a pleasanter place. A delicious perfume of aloes wood and pastils came from the open windows and mingled with the scent of rosewater which steamed up from the hot pavement. Within the palace, he heard some music, as of many instruments cunningly played, and the melodious warble of nightingales and other birds, and by this, and by the appetizing smell of many dainty dishes of which he presently became aware, he judged that feasting and merrymaking were going on. He wondered who lived in this magnificent house which he had never seen before, the street on which it stood being one he seldom had occasion to pass. To satisfy his curiosity, he went up to some splendidly dressed servants who stood at the door and asked one of them the name of the master of the mansion.
What? You live in Baghdad and not know that here lives the noble Sinbad the sailor, that famous traveler who sailed over every sea upon which the sun shines?
The porter, who had often heard people speak of the immense wealth of Sinbad the sailor, could not help feeling envious of one whose lot seemed to be as happy as his own was miserable. Casting his eyes up to the sky, he exclaimed aloud,
Consider, mighty creator of all things, the differences between Sinbad's life and mine. Every day I suffer 1,000 hardships and misfortunes, and have hard work to get even through bad barley bread, to keep myself and my family alive. While the lucky Sinbad spends money right and left, and lives upon the fat of the land. What has he done that you should give him and this pleasant life? What have I done to deserve so hard a fate?
So saying, he stamped upon the ground like one beside himself with misery and despair. Just at this moment, a servant came out of the palace and, taking him by the arm, said,
Come with me. The noble Sinbad, my master, wishes to speak to you.
Sinbad the porter was not a little surprised at this summons, and feared that his unguarded words might have drawn upon him the displeasure of Sinbad the sailor. So he tried to excuse himself upon the pretext that he could not leave the burden in which had been entrusted to him on the street. However, the lackey promised him that it should be taken care of, and urged him to obey the call so pressingly that at last the porter was obliged to yield. He followed the servant into a vast room, where a great company was seated round a table covered with all sorts of delicacies. In the place of honor sat a tall, grave man with a long white beard that gave him a venerable air. Behind his chair stood a crowd of attendants eager to minister to his wants. This was the famous Sinbad himself. The porter, more than alarmed at the sight of so much magnificence, tremblingly saluted the noble company. Sinbad, making a sign for him to approach, caused him to be seated at his right hand, and himself heaped choice morsels upon his plate, and poured out for him a draught of excellent wine. And presently, when the banquet came to a close, spoke to him familiarly, asking his name and occupation.
My lord, I am called Sinbad.
Sinbad the sailor continued,
I'm glad to see you here. And I'll ask for the rest of the company that they are equally pleased. But I wish you to tell me what it was that you said just now in the street.
At this question, Sinbad the porter was covered with confusion, and hanging down his head, replied,
My lord, I confess that overcome by weariness and ill humor, I uttered indiscreet words, which I pray you to pardon me.
Oh, do not imagine that I am so unjust as to blame you. On the contrary, I understand your situation and can pity you. Only you appear to be mistaken about me, and I wish to set you right. You doubtless imagine that I have acquired all the wealth and luxury that you see me enjoy without difficulty or danger, but this is far indeed from being the case. I have only reached this happy state after having for years suffered every possible kind of toil and danger. Yes, I assure you that my adventures have been strange enough to deter even the most avaricious men from seeking wealth by traversing the seas. Since you have, perhaps, heard but confused accounts of my 7 voyages and the dangers and wonders that I have met by sea and land, I will now give you a full and true account of them, which I think you will be pleased to hear.
This, O happy king, is a story of the 4th voyage of Sinbad concerning his visit to the mountain of the dead. You shall hear the tale, my prince, in Sinbad's own voice.
Rich and happy as I was after my 3rd voyage, I could not make my mind up to stay at home altogether. My love of trading and the pleasure I took in anything that was new and strange made me set my affairs in order and begin my journey through some of the Persian provinces, having first sent off stores of goods to await my coming in the different places I intended to visit. I took the ship at a distant seaport, and for some time all went well. But at last, being caught in a violent hurricane, our vessel became a total wreck in spite of all our work the captain could do to save her, and many of my company perished in the waves. I, with a few others, had the good fortune to be watched ashore clinging to pieces of the wreck, for the storm had driven us near an island, and scrambling up beyond the reach of the waves, we threw ourselves down quite exhausted to wait for morning.
At daylight, we wandered inward and soon saw some huts to which we directed our steps. As we drew near, the inhabitants swarmed out in great numbers and surrounded us, and we were led to the houses and, as it were, divided among our captors. I, with 5 others, were taken into a hut, where we were made to sit upon the ground, and certain herbs were given to us, which our captors made signs for us to eat. Observing that they themselves did not touch them, I was careful only to pretend to taste my portion, though my companions, being very hungry, rashly ate them all up, everything that was set before them. And very soon I had the horror of seeing them become perfectly mad. Though they chatted incessantly, I could not understand a word they said, nor did they heed any that I spoke to them. The savages now produced large bowls full of rice prepared with coconut oil, of which my crazy comrades eagerly ate. But I only tasted a few grains, understanding clearly that the objective of our captors was to fatten us up speedily for their own eating. And this was exactly what happened. My lucky companions, having lost their reason, felt soon fat, and that was the end of them. But I grew leaner by the day, for I ate but little, and even that little did me no good for reason of my own fear of what lay before me. However, as I was so far from being a tempting morsel, I was allowed to wander about freely, and one day, when all the captors had gone off upon some expedition, leaving only an old man to guard me, I managed to escape from him and plunged into the forest, running faster the more he cried for me to come back until I had completely distanced him.
For 7 days I hurried on, resting only when the darkness stopped me, and living chiefly upon coconuts, which afforded me both meat and drink. And on the 8th day I reached the seashore, and saw a party of men gathering pepper, which grew abundantly all about. Reassured by the nature of their occupation, I advanced towards them, and they greeted me in Arabic, asking who I was and whence I came. My delight was great on hearing this familiar speech, and I willingly satisfied their curiosity, telling them how I had been shipwrecked and captured by the natives. "But these savages devour men," said they. "How did you escape?" I repeated to them what I had just told you, at which they were mightily astonished. I stayed with them until they had collected as much pepper as they wished, and then they took me back to their own country and presented me to their king, by whom I was hospitably received. To him also I had to relate my adventures, which surprised him much, and when I had finished, he ordered that I should be supplied with food and raiment and treated with consideration.
The island on which I found myself was full of people, and abounded in all sorts of desirable things, and a great deal of traffic went on in the capital, where I soon began to feel at home and contented. Moreover, the king treated me with special favor, and in consequence of this, everyone, whether at court or in the town, sought to make life pleasant to me. One thing I remarked, which I thought very strange. This was that, from the greatest to the least, all men rode their horses without bridle or stirrups. I one day presumed to ask His Majesty why he did not use them, to which he replied,
You speak to me of things I had never heard before.
This gave me an idea. I found a clever workman and made him cut out under my direction the foundation of the saddle, which I padded and covered with choice leather, adorning it with rich gold embroidery. I then got a locksmith to make me a bit and a pair of spurs after a pattern that I drew for him. And when all these things were completed, I presented them to the king and showed him how to use them. When I had saddled one of his horses, he mounted it and rode around quite delighted with the novelty. And to show his gratitude, he rewarded me with large gifts. After this, I had to make saddles for all the principal officers of the king's household. And as they all gave me rich presents, I soon became very wealthy and quite an important person in the city. One day, the king sent for me and said,
Sinbad, I'm going to ask a favor of you. Both I and my subjects esteem you and wish you to end your days among us. Therefore, I desire that you will marry a rich and beautiful lady whom I will find for you, and think no more of your own country.
As the king's will was law, I accepted the charming bride he presented to me and lived happily with her. Nevertheless, I had every intention of escaping at the first opportunity and going back to Baghdad. Things were thus going well with me when it happened that the wife of one of my neighbors, with whom I had struck up quite a friendship, fell ill and presently died. I went to his house to offer my consolations and found him in the depths of woe. Heaven preserve you, said I, and send you a long life.
Alas, what is the good of saying that when I have but an hour left to live?
Come. Surely it is not as bad as all that. I trust that you may be spared to me for many years.
I hope that your life may be long, but as for me, all is finished. I have set my house in order, and today I shall be buried with my wife. This has been the law upon our island from the earliest ages. The living husband goes to the grave with his dead wife, the living wife with her dead husband. So did our fathers, and so must we do. The law changes not, and all must submit to it.
As he spoke, the friends and relations of the unhappy pair began to assemble. The body, decked in rich robes and sparkling with jewels, was laid upon an open bier, and the procession started. Taking its way to a high mountain at some distance from the city, the wretched husband, clothed from head to toe, and a black mantle following mournfully.
When the place of interment was reached, the corpse was lowered, just as it was, into a deep pit. Then the husband, bidding farewell to all his friends, stretched himself out upon another bier, upon which there were laid 7 little loaves of bread and a pitcher of water. And he was also led down to the depths of that horrible cavern. And then a stone was laid upon the opening, and the melancholy company wended its way back to town.
You may imagine that I was no unmoved spectator of these proceedings. To all the others, it was a thing to which they had become accustomed from their youth up. But I was so horrified that I could not help telling the king how it struck me. Sire, I said, I am more astonished than I can express to you at the strange custom which exists in your dominion of burying the living with the dead. In all my travels, I have never before met with so cruel and horrible a law, he replied.
What would you have me do, Sinbad? It is a law for everybody. I myself should have buried the queen if she were to die first.
But your majesty, dare I ask if this law applies to foreigners also?
Why, yes. There are no exceptions to the rule if they married in the country.
When I heard this, I went home much cast down, and from that time forward my mind was never easy. If only my wife's little finger ached, I fancied she was going to die. And sure enough, before very long, she fell really ill, and in a few days breathed her last. My dismay was great, for it seemed to me that to be buried alive was even a worse fate than to be devoured by cannibals. Nevertheless, there was no escape. The body of my wife, arrayed in her richest robes and decked with all her jewels, was laid upon the bier. I followed it, and after me came a great procession, headed by the king and all his nobles, and in this order we reached the fatal mountain, which was one of a lofty chain bordering the sea.
Here I made one more frantic effort to excite the pity of the king and those who stood by, hoping to save myself even at this last moment, but it was to no avail. No one spoke to me, didn't even appear to hasten over the dreadful task, and I speedily found myself descending into the gloomy pit, with my 7 loaves and pitcher of water beside me. Almost before I reached the bottom, the stone was rolled into place above my head, and I was left to my fate. A feeble ray of light shone into the cavern through some chink, and when I had the courage to look about me, I could see that I was in a vast vault, bestrewn with bones and bodies of the dead. I even fancied that I heard the expiring sighs of those who, like myself, had come into this dismal place alive. All in vain did I shriek aloud with rage and despair, reproaching myself for the love of gain and adventure which brought me to such a pass. But at length, growing calmer, I took up my bread and water, and wrapping my face in my metal, I groped my way towards the end of the cavern, where the air was fresher.
Here I lived in darkness and misery until my provisions were exhausted. But just as I was nearly dead from starvation, the rock was rolled away overhead, and I saw a bier was being lowered into the cavern, and at that the corpse upon it belonged to a man. In a moment my mind was made up. The woman who followed had nothing to expect but a lingering death. I should be doing her a service if I shortened her misery. Therefore, when she descended, already insensible from terror, I was ready armed with a huge bone. One blow left her dead, and I secured the bread and water which gave me hope for a life. Several times did I have recourse to do this desperate expedient, and I know not how long I had been a prisoner, when one day I fancied that I heard something near me, which breathed loudly. Turning from my place to where the sound came, I dimly saw a shadowy form which fled at my movement, squeezing itself through the cranny in the wall. I pursued it as fast as I could, and I found myself along a narrow crack among the rocks, along which I was just able to force my way. I followed it for it seemed like many miles, and at last saw before me a glimmer of light, which grew every moment, until I emerged upon the seashore with a joy that I cannot describe. When I was sure that I was not dreaming, I realized that doubtlessly it was a little animal which had found its way into the cavern from the sea, and when disturbed had fled, showing me a means of escape which I could never have discovered by myself. I hastily surveyed my surroundings and saw that I was in fact safe from all pursuit from the town.
The mountains sloped sheer down to the sea, and there was no road across them. Being assured of this, I returned to the cavern and amassed a rich treasure of diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and jewels of all kinds which strewed the ground. These I made up into bales and stored them in a safe place upon the beach, and then waited hopefully for the passing of a ship. I had looked out for 2 days, however, before a single sail appeared, so it was with much delight that I at last saw a vessel not very far from the shore, and by waving my arms and uttering loud cries, succeeded in attracting the attention of the crew. A boat was sent off to me, and in answer to the question of the sailors as to how I came to be in such a plight, I replied that I had been shipwrecked 2 days before, but had managed to scramble ashore with the bales which I pointed out to them. Luckily for me, they believed my story, and without even looking at the place where they found me, took up my bundles and rowed me back to the ship. Once on board, I soon saw that the captain was too much occupied with the difficulties of navigation to pay much heed to me, though he generously made me welcome, and would not even accept the jewels with which I offered to pay my passage. Our voyage was prosperous, and after visiting many lands and collecting in each place great store of goodly merchandise, I found myself at last in Baghdad once more with unheard of riches of every description. Again, I gave large sums of money to the poor, and enriched all the mosques in the city, after which I gave myself up to my friends and relations, with whom I passed my time in feasting and merriment.
Here, Sinbad paused, and all his hearers declared that the adventures of his fourth voyage had pleased them better than anything they had heard before. They then took their leave, followed by Sinbad the porter, who, with the rest, had been bidden to return next day for the story of the fifth voyage. When the time came, all were in their places, and when they had eaten and drunk of all that was set before them, Sinbad began his tale.
Not even all that I had gone through could make me contented with a quiet life. I soon worried of its pleasures and longed for a change and adventure. Therefore, I set out once more, but this time in a ship of my own, which I built and fitted out at the nearest seaport. I wished to be able to call whatever port I chose, taking my own time, but as I did not intend carrying enough goods for a full cargo, I invited several merchants of different nations to join me. We set sail with the first favorable wind, and after a long voyage upon the open seas, we landed upon an unknown island which proved to be uninhabited. We determined, however, to explore it, but had not gone far when we found a roc's egg, as large as the one I had seen before, and evidently very nearly hatched, for the beak of the young bird had already pierced the shell. In spite of all I could say to deter them, the merchants who were with me fell upon it with their hatchets, breaking the shell and killing the young roc. Then, lighting a fire upon the ground, they hacked morsels from the bird and proceeded to roast them while I stood by aghast. Scarcely had they finished their ill-omened repast when the air above us was darkened by two mighty showers. The captain of my ship, knowing my experience what was meant,
cried out to us that the parent birds were coming and urged us to get on board with all speed.
But morning overtook Scheherazade, and she lapsed in silence. As the day dawned and it was light, her sister Dinazad said,
What a strange and wonderful story.
The story of the fifth voyage of Sinbad the Sailor is even stranger and more wonderful than that of his fourth voyage, and I shall continue it tomorrow night, but only if the king will let me live.
The lively appreciation of a good story may perhaps be explained to a certain extent by the conditions of life in pre-Islamic and early Islamic times. In a society where entertainments were few and reading were not within everybody's reach, the resources of human intercourse were of great importance. They not only provided diversion, but ranked among man's principal means of asserting himself as a civilized being. Stories, as much as poetry, could be perpetuated by oral tradition, and there is ample proof that they were. Later, when a more refined urban culture prevailed over desert life, the particular form of pastime offered by storytelling found its professionals. This development affirms the lasting popularity of which the 1001 Nights in all its aspects offers such interesting proofs. Mia Irene Gerhardt, from The Art of Storytelling, a literal study of the 1001 Nights.
The stories of the 1001 Nights appear on first encounter to appeal principally through their exotic, fantastic, and sensual features. And indeed, they were filled with kings and caliphs of all the panoply of court life, with enormous and terrifying jinns, with magicians both good and evil and of both sexes, and with adventures that are by turns horrible, wonderful, bloody, and sublime. Yet the collection opens with the instruction that we are to read these tales, not merely to be amused or distracted, but to be admonished and restrained.
the lives of former generations are a lesson to prosperity. A man may review the remarkable events that have befallen others, and so be admonished. He may consider the history of people of preceding ages, and so be restrained. Praise be He who has ordained that the history of the former generations be a lesson to those which follow. Thus are the tales of the 1001 Nights.
At the bottom, the tale of Shahryar and Scheherazade is about male wounding and how it can destroy the bond between men and women. The theme is one that is both general and ordinary. It is also a story about justice and about madness and its cure. If on first encounter it excites our interest by its strangeness, it is its profound familiarity that engrosses us at least. Jerome W. Clinton, Madness and Cure in 1001 Nights.
It was now the 1001st night. During this period, Scheherazade had 3 sons by the king. And when she finished the story of Maruf, the cobbler and his wife Fatima, she got to her feet before kissing the ground in front of the king.
King of the age, and unique ruler of this time, I am your servant. And for 1001 nights I have been telling stories of past generations and moral tales of our predecessors. May I hope to ask you to grant me a request?
Ask, and your wish will be granted.
She then called to her nurses and the eunuchs, telling them to fetch her children, which they did quickly. Of the 3 boys, 1 could walk, another at the stage of crawling, and the third was but a suckling. When they were brought in, she took them and placed them before the king. Then she kissed the ground again and said,
King of the age, these are your children, and my wish is that as an act of generosity towards them, you free me from the sentence of death. For if you kill me, these babies will have no mother, and you will find no other woman to bring them up so well.
Shahryar's asocial behavior is remedied by Scheherazade, who cures the king of his extremism, and it could be said that she represents the force of renewal, her creative and life-giving stories paralleling the life-giving motherhood that overturns the violence and destruction of patriarchy gone awry. More than a nurturing mother figure, however, Scheherazade possesses great learning, intelligence, and cleverness. The prologue notes that she had read the books of literature, philosophy, and medicine. She knew poetry by heart, had studied historical reports, and was acquainted with the sayings of men and the maxims of sages and kings. She was intelligent, wise, and refined. She had read and learned. Lisa Perfetti, Women and Laughter in Medieval Comic Literature.
In the picture of language and of mythology, woman represents the totality of what can be known. The hero is the one who comes to know. As he progresses in the slow initiation of which is life, the form of the goddess undergoes for him a series of transfigurations. She can never be greater than himself, though she can always promise more than he is yet capable of comprehending. She lures, she guides, she bids him burst of feathers. And if he can match her import, the two, the knower and the known, will be released from every limitation. Women is the guide to the sublime acme of sinuous adventure. By deficient eyes, she is reduced to inferior states. By the evil eye of ignorance, she is spellbound to banality and ugliness, but she is redeemed by the eyes of understanding. The hero who can take her as she is, without undue commotion, but with the kindness and assurance she requires, is potentially the king, the incarnate God of her created world. Joseph Campbell, author of The Hero with a Thousand Faces.
The king shed tears and gathering his sons to his breast, said to Shahrazad,
Even before the arrival of these children, I had intended to pardon you, as I have seen that you are a chaste and pure woman, freeborn and God-fearing. May God bless you, your father and mother, and your whole family, root and branch. I call God to my witness that I have decided that no harm is to come to you.
May God prolong your life and increase your dignity and the awe that you inspire.
Joy spread throughout the palace and from it to the city, and this was a night that stood outside the ordinary span of life, whiter than the face of day. In the morning, the happy king, overwhelmed by his good fortune, summoned his troops, and when they came, he presented a splendid and magnificent robe in honor of his vizier, Shahrazad's father.
May God shelter you because you gave me your noble daughter as a wife, and it is thanks to her that I have turned in repentance from killing the daughters of my subjects. I have found her noble, pure, chaste, and without sin. God has granted me with 3 sons by her, and I give thanks to him for his goodness.
While a reconciliation of the sexes is achieved, it runs along traditional lines. The king has fallen in love with Shahrazad. In one of the epilogue's versions, the king, as proof of his utmost appreciation of Shahrazad's tales, gives an order to have them written down. Desire may be one of the catchwords for psychoanalytically based studies. Literature is one for postmodern-oriented theorists. Shahrazad has indeed narrated the stories, but Shahryar is the one to preserve them, as he has the male command over the authority and permanence of the written word. In the process, body has been transmuted into word and back into body. Corporeality is the final word, as Shahrazad relinquishes her role of narrator for that of perfect woman, mother, and lover. Suzanne Inderwitz, author of Shahrazad, is one of us.
Shahryar then presented robes of honor to all his viziers, emirs, and ministers of state. On his instruction, the city was adorned with decoration for 30 days, and he did not ask any of the citizens for contributions from their own funds, as all of the costs and expenses were borne by the royal treasury. The splendor of decorations had never been matched before. Drums were beaten, pipes sounded, and every entertainer displayed his skill. The king showered gifts and presents on them, and he gave alms to the poor and needy, and his bounty extended to all his subjects living in his realm. He and his kingdom continued to enjoy prosperity, happiness, pleasure, and joy, until they were visited by the destroyer of delights and the parter of companions. Praise be to God, whom the passage of time does not wear away. He is not subject to change. His attention cannot be distracted, and he alone possesses the qualities of perfection. Blessing and peace be on the leader of his choice, and the best of his creation, Muhammad, the Lord of all mankind. It is through him that we pray to God that bring us a good end.